For over 30 years, we have been delivering you the most trusted, comprehensive, intelligent, and up-to-date news across every sector, every platform, every day. At Business News, we believe progress boils down to one simple habit. That is, what you subscribe to today shapes what you become tomorrow. Subscribe to success. Subscribe to Business News.
Greetings and welcome to this webinar with Pragma Lawyers. This is our latest in our Legally Speaking series discussing topical issues in commercial law. My name's Mark Pownell and I'm a Senior Editor at Business News. I'm joined today by Pragma Lawyers Special Counsel Melanie Lynn, who has extensive experience practicing commercial litigation and dispute resolution, to my immediate left, and Pragma Associate Emma Richards, also to my left, working in the disputes area, focusing on ESG and advising organisations on ESG. Welcome to both of you. Today we've got a wide-ranging discussion which will take us through the very contemporary issues of, well, we've mentioned ESG and also greenwashing. And I think we'll start there with greenwashing, Melanie. Now, greenwashing means, I think, different things to different people. Maybe you better give us a little bit of a synopsis of what that really does mean.
Sure, thanks, Mark. So greenwashing is the term that we use to describe misrepresentations made by businesses in relation to their ESG credentials or impacts. So companies are obviously at risk if they make patently false statements, for example, about their environmental achievements or record. But it's really important, I think, for companies to understand that they're also at risk if they make vague or general claims about their ESG credentials, which they can't substantiate with facts or with hard evidence or with data. So I think it's really important to understand that it's quite easy to inadvertently make a misleading and deceptive claim about your ESG credentials, and that's really what we're talking about when we're talking about greenwashing. So also too, I think people generally understand that this relates to representations you make about environmental matters, but we can also be talking here about representations you make about your social achievements, the social outcomes that you've achieved or intend to achieve.
Which are environment related or just broader than that?
Those can be statements that you make about other impacts, such as your involvement, for example, off the top of my head, your involvement or the impacts you're making in Indigenous communities, those sorts of things, whether you're investing in gambling, tobacco, those are sort of more social matters, and you can fall foul of the law in relation to those things too.
Now, I always think of greenwashing as this doesn't sound quite right to me, because I think of that laundering money as a criminal event and cleaning something up, whereas greenwashing it's almost the opposite, isn't it? It's claiming to be something that you're not really, that you've affected the environment in a better way than you really have, or that sort of thing.
I think that's right. I think the problem is it's not a term of art, it's not a legal term. It's a term which lawyers are using because it's the current term that's being used in the media. It's actually not a term that we're very comfortable with. If we were using our language, we would say it's misleading and deceptive conduct around ESG matters. That's what a lawyer would call it. But in the media, we're talking about greenwashing, I think.
Yeah. Okay. And obviously we're in an environment now with all sorts of stuff around requirements for companies to act in certain ways, and some companies are claiming they want to save the planet and others are just trying to do the right thing. But it doesn't really matter, because people may, I guess, purchase goods or do business with someone based on their environmental credentials.
That's exactly right. And I think what the regulators now understand and have been at pains to point out is that the things you say about these matters, these ESG matters, they are key to both investors and consumers. People are relying on those statements you make, and that's why it's getting a lot of attention.
And is that why it's in the news at the moment? 100%. Because there's sort of pointy things happening?
It's in the news because late last year, both regulators in this space, so that's the ACCC and ASIC, they both came out and said, this is going to be our focus going forward. So you had a statement, first of all, by the ACCC, and it was a very pointed statement. They said companies making statements about these things need to be able to substantiate any environmental or sustainability claims when marketing their goods or services. So that's pretty direct, that's pretty straightforward. You've got to be able to substantiate your claims. Don't just say things, make sure you can substantiate them. And then the Deputy Chair of the ACCC, she sort of went a bit further and she said, you've got to be able to prove what you say by using reliable scientific reports, transparent supply chain information, reputable third-party certification. You've got to be able to prove what you have said to be the case. You've got to be able to substantiate the claims you make. And then ASIC came out a little bit after that and they basically said a similar thing. They said that they would have, for 2023, one of their enforcement focuses would be representations made around ESG matters. So both of the regulars came out very clearly and said, watch out, we're on the alert for these sorts of matters.
Yeah, okay. And I'm just curious, maybe this is a bit backtracking, but you've got companies that are sort of saying we're sustainable. Like how much do you need to prove that?
Well, I think the point is if you can't substantiate it, and that's a pretty difficult thing to substantiate, if you can't substantiate it, then you're at risk at the moment and going forward. And you've been warned, really, that you are at risk. So I think general vague statements are dangerous. And I think that businesses, understandably, will often make a vague or general statement because they feel a bit more comfortable making that kind of statement rather than a really hard, specific representation as to what's going on. So I think vague general statements without much detail, ambiguous statements will potentially put you at risk.
Okay. Now you mentioned regulators making those kind of announcements. Yeah. So then what have they actually done?
They've done a lot. ASIC's done a lot. So in the last 6 months, they've issued a number of infringement notices to 4 different companies, 2 energy companies and 2 financial services companies. All of those infringement notices have resulted in the payment of fines by those companies. And I should add that those fines are paid on a without admission of liability basis, but obviously there's a reputational cost to those companies in relation to those things. There's all sorts of costs.
Does that mean that the companies didn't fight it in the courts? They rolled over and agreed to it?
My understanding is that they paid the fines on a without... That's what ASIC have told us, that they paid those fines on a without admission of liability basis. But then ASIC publishes the details of that, and it's publicly available information. The details of the infringement are publicly available. The whole thing is pretty transparent. So that's happened in the last 6 months, and then perhaps even more significantly, a couple of months ago, ASIC issued its first prosecution proceedings against Mercer Superannuation Australia Limited, which is obviously a large superannuation company. And that relates to claims that Mercer made, apparently, that relates to claims that Mercer made on its website about particular sustainable plus investment options for its customers. And now that's early days, that's only a couple of months old, that action, but potentially the outcome of that is more serious for the defendant. I mean, we don't know what will happen to that litigation, but that's a federal court proceeding which has been issued by ASIC. So a lot's happened. The ACCC haven't, to my knowledge, issued any infringement notices or issued any proceedings, but they've clearly indicated that they'll do so. They announced that they were conducting what they call an internet sweep, which I just understand to be a serious review of the statements companies are making in this space. I think they said that they're concerned about, which surprised me a bit, this number, they're concerned about around 60% of the statements that are being made by businesses. So I think you'll see from the ACCC there'll be action that follows in the near future.
I'm curious about an internet sweep. Is that something that's actually trawling, looking for something to act on? Or is it gathering a whole lot of information so that people can't later pull down statements and have them hidden, like it's there stored as evidence?
Well, possibly both. Okay. I mean, that's their remit, to make sure that, in the case of the ACCC, to make sure that consumers are protected. Yes. So I would have thought that they'll be looking at everything that's been said. They'll be looking at statements that are made about current matters. They'll be looking at statements that are made about future matters, you know, the predictions you're making about the things you're going to achieve. They'll be looking at the whole lot, and they are looking at the whole lot. So I don't know the full detail of how that's operating, but I think you can expect that it's being done pretty comprehensively.
No, I imagine so. Now, I am curious, you mentioned with the fines and the prosecution, you mentioned 2 energy companies, which I can imagine energy companies saying, you know, they're more greener than someone else or whatever. And then you mentioned 2 or 3 financial services companies. So I can see a very distinct difference there. There's people who are, I guess, acting on the ground in areas where sustainability is an issue, and then there's people who are, I guess, investing in or representing to investors, or maybe the energy companies are representing to investors as well. But I guess, is this the area where the rubber's hitting the road the most, do you think?
Yeah, I think financial services and financial products are a particular focus. I think they've actually said that. They've pointed that out. I think ASIC's pointed that out in its statements it made last year. And I think energy companies are an obvious target, right? Because it's a competitive investment space. And as I say, I think the regulators are aware that people will make investment decisions on the basis of these representations. So I think they're obvious targets, financial services, financial products and energy companies. But I also think that there are plenty of other potential targets. I think they haven't said that they're restricting their assessments to those sorts of companies. I think all companies, all businesses should be aware of the risks in relation to these sorts of claims.
Yes, well, I guess every business is trying to put forward a foot in the sustainability kind of area, and it doesn't matter whether you're a publisher saying we have the cleanest printing presses or whatever it is. I suppose everybody's at risk of sort of getting into that.
Yeah, if you manufacture laundry detergent, you know, it could be anything really.
So what have we learnt from these? If you kind of had to summarise it, what have we learnt from these events?
Look, it is a bit difficult because we don't have a lot of case law yet. It's coming, but we don't quite have it yet. I think generally I would say be very careful about that you don't overstate your environmental credentials or achievements. As I said to you earlier, I think vague comparisons are quite dangerous. Claims like 100% recycled, you've got to be able to substantiate that claim. Claims like, in relation to financial services or products, let's say, no investment in fossil fuels. Not only does it have to be true, you've got to be able to substantiate it. And all the claims you make need to be completely defensible. So even something like uses less water, like that might be too ambiguous, right? In comparison to what? In comparison to your other products? In comparison to your competitors' products? Like, I think ambiguous statements are dangerous, and I think you've got to be careful with those. The other thing I'd say is, and a lawyer's always going to say this, always be extra careful about statements you make as to future matters, and that's because the onus is then upon you to prove that you had a reasonable basis for making those claims. But I think in this space, it's quite common to see people making claims like net zero by 2030. You've got to be able to prove that you had a reasonable basis for making those claims.
Right, so it's not the government or anything that can say that and worry about that, kick that down the road.
Exactly. Just because it's being said at a I mean, it's terrible to say, but just because it's being said at a governmental level doesn't mean you should just blithely repeat the promise, unless you can show that it's going to be true.
I imagine that some of this is a bit fraught, and we'll get into a little bit with Emma as well, but a bit fraught around supply chain, especially perhaps if you're relying on goods or services that are coming from another country, for instance. Very difficult to prove that something's, I mean, it's difficult to prove it, imagine, in Australia, but even more so
Very
overseas.
difficult indeed. And Emma's going to get into that detail because essentially the advice here is to put the horse before the cart, right? To get your ESG framework in place, and then from that framework, if it's properly implemented, from that you'll be able to much more easily work out what representations you can accurately make. Once you do that work, it will be a lot easier for you to say, okay, we can make the following representations about these things because we understand our supply chain.
Yeah. Now, just briefly, what other than the risks you mentioned, what other risks are there around that you'd be prosecuted on?
We're talking today really about greenwashing and what I prefer to call misleading and deceptive conduct, but there are other problems coming. I think it's important to note that I think we're going to see in Australia, like we've seen in other jurisdictions, we're going to see class actions by special interest groups, activism groups. We're going to see actions being brought by shareholders. We're going to be seeing actions being brought by consumers. I think there's a fair bit of litigation that is ahead coming in Australia, which we've probably not seen that much of at this stage. But there's plenty of things to think about, I think, is the point.
And then obviously the big question, how do businesses avoid those risks?
Well, I think that comes back to what Emma's going to talk about, and that is implement your ESG strategy. I'm not saying it's an easy thing to do. It's not straightforward. It's technical. But once you do that, once you put the horse before the cart, everything will get a bit easier to manage, and you'll be able to avoid the risks that we've talked about today. I think there are other things you can do. I think you should a business should regularly review representations it's making about these things. And I'm talking about things that you say on your website, product disclosure statements, things you say to the ASX, things you say to consumers, things you say to investors. All of those things should be reviewed on a regular basis. The other thing I would say is that from an organisational point of view, I think it's really important that your external communications people are talking to your compliance people. In other words, your marketing people aren't saying things that your compliance people aren't happy with. You need to be able to run those things by the compliance team and say, can we say the following things about these products or about these services? And you've got to have those two talking to each other. And I think just generally, be cautious, especially everybody's been warned, things are afoot. So I think be cautious in this space, think twice before you make representations about these things, and always an inch of prevention is worth a pound of cure, and I think that's the best advice for people, I think.
No, very good. Thanks, Melanie. Well, look, I think that does segue very nicely into Emma, and I guess, greenwashing is an element of the broader ESG discussion, but broadly speaking, we've covered a few of these bits, but why do you think ESG is important? What are the important elements? Why has it become important?
Well, it's important for two reasons. Firstly, currently ESG is being considered by businesses through a sporadic set of regulatory requirements, both mandatory and voluntary reporting requirements is what we're talking about specifically. And we see that the ASX corporate governance principles and recommendations do require businesses to disclose their material ESG risks, so material, environmental, social governance risks. And importantly, the recommendation is that to that commentary, it is recommended that you can disclose those risks through either a sustainability report. However, it's not a requirement. But if you choose to do so, then you must do so in accordance with international frameworks, and an internationally recognised framework at that. And the issue with that is there is a plethora of international frameworks out there, and businesses face the challenge of having to A, elect whether or not they're going to produce an integrated report, and B, elect whether they're going to produce a sustainability report. And if they go down that road, they're then facing the challenge of coming up with a preferred set of standards that they're going to follow based on the internationally recognised standards. Those standards, currently the International Sustainability Standards Board, are in the process of consolidating. So we will see that soon there will be a consolidated set of standards which should assist organisations in the direction that they take with that.
And as we move quite quickly, I gather, in that to where we'll have this sort of global framework, Does that then mean it'll become mandatory at that point, do you think, or is it still a kind of voluntary element? Or, how much are we shifting from we decide to do this to we have to do this?
So in December last year, the Australian Treasury announced Australia's proposed climate-related disclosures to be mandatory commencing the financial year 2024-2025. This is purely for climate-related disclosures. However, it also announced that it's going to roll out subsequently to align with the rollout of the ISSB global standards, a more generalised mandatory requirement for those more general sustainability disclosures.
Yeah. Okay, so that's the green side of it, but and maybe just explain to the viewers there's a whole bunch of other stuff here. You've got your social stuff, you've got your corporate governance, all that. What are some of the things that we're really, what's the right word? Where the pointy bits that you're kind of encountering a lot?
Look, absolutely, and I mean currently we have mandatory requirements to report under the Modern Slavery Act, for instance, so certain disclosures under that legislation. There are a lot of mandatory things that organisations need to consider under existing legislation. However, this really consolidates everything and brings it all together. So if we're looking at the generalised set of standards, that is something that's going to really touch upon the S and the G as well as the E, and it's important that businesses do bear in mind that they're not mutually exclusive. You do need to consider them as one bundle, and when you are assessing your material risks, you do need to consider each element carefully.
But some of the things we'd be talking about is like gender balance in a workplace or pay equity. There'd be things like other diversity issues in the workplace and how you're dealing with them, that kind of thing.
Absolutely. And we see in Singapore there is a requirement to disclose board diversity. So that's other regions and how they're approaching it, but it wouldn't be unusual to expect something like that in Australia.
So how do companies prepare for something like this?
Well, the first thing that you really need to do is stay up to date with the global developments. I think Australia have importantly set a roadmap for what they're going to do, so businesses now have some indication where they're going. So that's really a great starting point. The first thing I would say is to just become familiar with those global standards. The ISSB have published guidelines. They're available. They've also said that Standard 1 and Standard 2 will become available in 2024 in January. So to be mindful of when that is released. The second thing to do is to really look at your organisation and your corporate governance framework and conduct a overview of that process with the view of creating an ESG framework. And we can talk about what that involves in greater detail. So firstly, what you would consider is what your material risks are. So your material ESG risks. Really, if you're aware of those, then it makes the process a little easier. So it's quite overwhelming to begin with, but you do start there and you conduct a materiality assessment, and you can seek guidance in how to do that. But that's really about coming up with an ESG checklist. And on that checklist, you'll have your material impacts, so both positive and negative. And it's important to bear in mind that both positive and negative impacts are important for reasons that you can actively make a positive statement about your organisation's contribution if you're aware of that impact. And you're then going to reduce the risks of greenwashing and some of the other risks that Melanie's touched upon. So once you've gone down that road, you then have a checklist of items that you can confidently say your organisation has a positive and a negative impact. Then you look at your organisation and your corporate governance framework, and you can see where all of this fits in. What does your corporate governance framework currently look like, and how might it best be amended or developed in order to manage these risks, but also in order to perform correct due diligence on these risks? Then you can report upon those confidently.
And I mean, I guess I'm thinking about how all this will impact on the evolution of these on business. And I suppose a little bit like what Melanie said, there's a flow down, right? It's not just some people at the top ticking some boxes. They've got to get people below to act. Is that right? It becomes sort of I guess, part of culture in a business?
Absolutely. A huge part of ESG is corporate values, firstly. But you can't just look at creating a set of corporate values without having an implementation plan. And that's what an ESG framework would look like. And a good ESG framework, to touch upon that point, is having a ESG working group at the bottom of the chain. So for instance, this might not work for your organisation. It really largely depends on what your material impacts are going to be and what your risk is. However, what one might look like is at the bottom, you may have an ESG working group made up of executives, managers, or even employees who are responsible for the implementation of policies that are set by a sustainability committee, for instance, who have responsibility of oversight. And they will then report to the board, and the board will have ultimate oversight of the whole process. The other thing to touch upon as well is external assurance. So if you're looking at this process, it's a good idea to think about how you might turn your mind to independent external assurance in this process. And to touch upon that point of the ground up, that's something that the ESG working group may be able to assist with, seeking that, engaging that external assurance, and also in assisting with stakeholder engagement, which is something that people in the upper levels would quite frankly not have the time to actually engage in doing in a practical sense.
Got it. And I guess, I mean, you kind of touched on it there. What sort of, some of the businesses that you're talking about there sound like big business to me. You know, they've got boards and they've got what's the sort of tier of impact at the moment? I assume the biggest companies are the global companies hit it first, and then it tiers down. Where do, you know, for instance, West Australian, you know, are we talking about listed companies and listed mining companies? Or are we talking about everybody in WA, for instance?
Well, Australia have said that the first companies to be affected, and this follows suit with lots of the other regional developments, are going to be the listed entities. But I wouldn't discount large private companies. We see in places like the UK, they have rolled out legislation to amend the Companies Act to introduce mandatory climate-related disclosures for large private companies, for instance. So it really is looking at, if you're serious about this as a business and you want to get ahead, maybe start with the simple things and looking at your corporate governance framework, turning your mind to your impacts. And you can really do that by knowing your company and knowing your organisation, and also having some kind of visibility over how far that impact will extend. So everybody is really going to be captured under this umbrella, and should be at the current status of the world at the moment. However, in terms of the rollout, you're looking at large listed companies first, and then it will go from there.
Great. Thank you very much, Emma. Thank you, Melanie. Thanks very much for the informative discussion, and we'll leave it at that. Thank you.